Ryan, thanks for joining us. By my count, there appears to be new funding for at least 11 of the calls to action. What do you make of the investments being promised?
You know, I think there's a lot of pretty positive gestures in this recent federal budget and over a wide variety of calls to action that were called for by the TRC. So if we take a look, well, there are investments made in accountability. There's specific money set aside for the National Council on Reconciliation. That National Council is very critically important. We've often said that that's maybe the most important of all the calls to action because it invests in ongoing accountability, monitoring status of the TRC's calls to action, and the statistics on whether or not this gap that exists in this country is widening or closing. And then we see other really important investments in youth, Jordan's Principle, and even some very important funding for the children that never returned home from the residential schools. So in general, I think it's pretty positive.
There's also funding in there for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and I see there's been some movement on that.
Yeah, that's what I think is important to recognize in this budget, is that we are seeing the government try to lock in some of the big pieces, the big ticket items, if you will, that are going to help continue this process of truth and reconciliation in this country for decades or generations to come. So the call for the National Day is being implemented. There's monies being set aside. The government has introduced a bill on that. Again, we come back to the National Council on Reconciliation, very important. And then we also see that corresponding investment in the Commissioner for Indigenous Languages and investments in Indigenous languages. Of course, we know that reconciliation can't occur without Indigenous languages. So these are things that are going to serve us well, not just in the short term, but well into the long term of this country.
And just to note, there was some discussion on what that day was going to be for National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and it'll be September 30th. Rye, was there anything missing?
Well, you know, there's 94 calls to action. There's always, I think, a general desire to see all of them implemented. You know, when we look again at that National Council for Reconciliation, it's fair to state that the interim board did call for a larger endowment, a larger investment. I think it's going to be really interesting to hear from that interim board how they feel about the monies that have been set aside, how much they feel this enables the realization of the mandate. We have to remember that that National Council is going to be asking for the production of information, statistics, data from municipalities, from businesses, from churches, from provincial governments, from child welfare agencies, from the federal government. So it's got a huge, huge, huge role to play. It was given about $124 million. I think it's going to be a very fair question to ask them whether or not they feel that's enough. They did ask for more. But, it gets us out of the door and it gets something started on that, which is critical.
So, Ryan, how would you say the federal government is doing when it comes to its pledge to implement all of the 94 calls to action?
We get asked that question a lot, and I think generally there's some pretty important efforts being made. Some of the things that are the big ticket items, again, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, we have that, it's stabilizing, it's there. Our mandate is being supported. The National Council, I keep coming back to that. The Indigenous Languages Commission, the National Day for Reconciliation, Jordan's Principle, the huge investments in Indigenous child welfare. I mean, these were real cornerstones of a lot of the work that the Commission called for. Is there more that they can do? Absolutely. Are we going to keep the pressure on every single day? That's our job. But, we have to recognize that we're still in the early days of this national journey of truth and reconciliation, and if we can get some of these big pieces anchored in, that's going to serve us well, whether it's a Liberal government or a Conservative government or NDP government. These are the pieces, some of these that are real anchor points that I think we should celebrate.
Right, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you coming in to talk with us about this.
Thanks very much.